Hello again, everybody. We will continue our conference. And I'm pleased now to introduce Philippe Bourmaud. Philippe Bourmaud is Assistant Professor of Modern and Contemporary History, Lyon III University, Moulin in France. He has spent several years since 2000 doing research in the Middle East, mainly in the Palestinian Authority, to write its PhD dissertation on the subject Doktor, devenir médecin et exercer son art en Terre sainte, une expérience du pluralisme médical dans l'Empire ottoman finissant. His research topics include the history of medicine in the Middle East and in international context, the history of interreligious relations in the Middle East, the history of the internationalization of the question of Palestine. Is now working on the construction of social problems in the mandates of the League of Nations, with a focus on the Middle Eastern mandates. And he has done some good research in the archives of the ACO. By the way, we have complete and very good archives to be researched and exploited and so on. So Philippe, you can put your camera on and your micro on. You will speak about this mandate time in Syria and Lebanon, where France exercised this mandate. And this is exactly the period where ACO was born and Paul Béron started to found ACO. And as Thomas said just before, the reason was that Paul Béron was now a French citizen, so he could come back to Aleppo. So thank you very much, Philippe.
Well, thank you, Mathieu, and good evening to everyone. Well, here it's getting the evening. First, I'd like to present a short apology. In this presentation, I will take a largely geopolitical approach, which may come as disincarnate with few actors, or especially few actors among the co-workers or the people who participated in the ACO's activities, or who, also were its beneficiaries. I've taken a geopolitical approach, first for me to help myself lay the groundwork of ACO work, also because this is the first presentation I make on the history of the ACO after working there in the archives for a little over a year. And so, well, I'm also trying to clarify things for myself. So I'd like to begin by saying that it's a bit complicated to call the ACO French Protestant work in French mandatory Syria and Lebanon. In institutional terms, in functional terms, it makes sense, but it's probably much less efficient at the level of the staff of the organization, or about as to how people felt about what they were doing. But for a number of reasons, some of which Thomas Wild have just mentioned, French Protestant work, for lack of a better word, in the mandate was the result of post-World War I politics. It was the case of the other French Protestant organization, the French Protestant parish in Beirut, and the connected œuvres protestantes françaises en Syrie au Liban, which have been studied by Jean-Pierre Erard and Georges Krebs in their book Le Protestantisme français et le Levant. And they show that basically these guys came to the Near East largely on circumstantial grounds, namely to well, to take possession of the remaining real estate and buildings left by the German Protestant missionary institutions after the defeat of Germany and their expulsion in 1918. In his autobiography, Paul Béron explains that to some extent it's also something similar that happened with the Action Chrétienne en Orient. Following the Ententiste victory in 1918, German Protestant missionaries were expelled, including the Hilfsbund für christliche Liebeswerk in Orient, mentioned by Professor Haigazian, also known as the Frankfurt Committee, but here I will call it shortly the Hilfsbund. The Hilfsbund had been active in Marash and Aleppo and had sent in 1921 Béron to report on the situation of its former institutions and on the situation of Armenian refugees in Syria to make an assessment of the needs. And Béron came back with the conviction that emergency relief work was needed there, but also with the impression that it could not be undertaken by a German institution. So basically it's out of a decision of the Hilfsbund itself not to remain formally in Syria that the Action Chrétienne en Orient was founded on the 6th of December 1922. Needless to say, the association met at first, at least, with a degree of skepticism on the part of the French mandatory authorities. At the same time, the said French mandatory authorities were like the beggars that could not be choosers, if you accept that expression, because they were strapped for cash by the French government, and they could hardly dismiss a humanitarian agency, let alone one headed by a French citizen, if it was not clearly a German institution, which was just out beyond the pale for them. This raises a larger problem, which I will try to address here, namely that of the relations between the ACO and other national actors, and the implications of these relations for the ACO's work. In his autobiography, again, Béron insists on his intent to maintain the missionary character of the work, a calling which perspires through the publications of the ACO during the interwar period as well. Yet, even between missionary organizations, there were differences of priorities. Was the insistence on the missionary dimension of the work consistently directing the relations of the ACO with other national actors? What role did the international character of the ACO, with its 3 European committees in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and France, play in the matter? I will first examine here what sources are at our disposal, then move on to basically cover the goals of the work of the ACO, which were by no means limited to goals of preaching, spiritual work, but which were suffused with it, definitely. And I will then chart the relations between the ACO and organizations of various nationality. So, to be quick on the matter of sources, I have come across 2 main repositories containing documentation on the ACO, and I'm very interested and curious about the missing part of it. So I will speak about Switzerland and France. My question here would be, and the Netherlands, are there institutional, is there an institutional repository for the ACO's archive, or the archives of the Dutch community, the Dutch committee supporting the ACO? So first, Switzerland, by order of magnitude of breadth and number of items. I shall begin with a smaller one. About 10 boxes of archives of the Swiss Committee of the ACO are held at the Archives cantonales vaudoises in Renan, right next to the Université de Lausanne. These cover mostly the work of the ACO from 1937 onwards. They include minutes of the Swiss Committee, reports and letters from the field in Syria, and also after 1945, a lot on the work of the ACO in Algeria and Tunisia. Due to transportation difficulties, well, living in times of pandemics, and I have not been able to go through more than a couple of them. And I'm very curious to discover what documentation there can be for the period between 1941 and 1945. So between the moment when Syria is under French and British occupation at the time. And so the links with the Netherlands and France are cut, but not with Switzerland. And 1945, which is when basically the links get restored. During that period, the Swiss Committee under the gentlemen Nussle and Burnier keep supporting the work in Syria and the missionaries there, Hedwig Bull to begin with. At the ACO house in Strasbourg, there is a significant mass of documentation. Around 250 boxes have been catalogued, and last summer, a mission of the association Archivistes Sans Frontières found about 250 more boxes relating mostly to the period after 1997. So out of my scope here, definitely. The house also keeps a complete series of Le Levant, the ACO's monthly, in French and German, as well as photographic glass plates and a cupboard full of an interesting object, which are basically like metal plates of the pictures which appeared in the Levant. But because of their format, which is uniform, I don't think it can be the original plates that were used to print the journal. And so I'm left puzzling about their use, but any hypothesis about this, I'm very grateful for. So this was just to cover about the material that there is. So there's quite a bit to work on, and I'm very happy for everyone who would be able to work on it, and I've been trying to get some friends in missionary history to join me in this. But to move to the core of my matter, the ACO had in Syria a mission. It was definitely situating itself as a mission, but multiple projects. And the existing literature on the ACO, be it Béron's autobiography or the brochures that he published, as well as the biography of Hedwig Bull that has been written by Dr. Vartan Grigorian, give us a summary of the various activities of the association that focused on Aleppo, but gradually expanded to the Alexandrite region, the Upper Jizire, and also the Be'ar Valley in Lebanon, all this before 1939. In Aleppo, there was first a dispensary, and after 1925, a hospital, 2 workshops where Armenian women wove clothes, food rations and clothes distributions for poor children, teaching support for Armenian Protestant schools, and also work in assisting in the building of new houses to rehouse and settle Armenian refugees out of the refugee camps around the city. To this, we may add in the autonomous Sanjak of Alexandretta, summer camps in the village of Atuk, led by Hedwig Bull from 1928 onwards. In the Upper Jazireh, work was started in the 1930s with the establishment of Armenian and later Assyrian refugees in the Khabur Valley. But the work extended all the way to the very end of the Duck's Beak there, the kind of triangle between Turkey, between contemporary Turkey and Iraq, east of Syria. Missionary work and a school in Hassache were taken over from earlier Protestant missionary efforts, and work was started in the villages of Derik and Khanik in the vicinity of the Tigris River, right on the border. There, the work no longer focused on refugees, but it was directed especially at the local Arab Protestant communities and the Kurdish population of the Jazireh. This created functional difficulties as the staff of the ACO so far was mostly fluent in Armenian and Turkish and had to, well, get on with learning new languages, namely Arabic and Kurdish, or recruit actually scarce staff for the job. The ACO presence in Lebanon also grew at the tail end of the 1930s with the mass exodus of the Armenians from the Sanjak of Alexandretta after its inclusion in Turkey in June 1939. The ACO took part in organizing their relocation in Anjar. And around the same period, another object of interest for the ACO was the possibility of settling in Syria German refugees among Jewish converts to Christianity, which had been submitted to intensified violence following Kristallnacht. So here the ACO was more as a go-between between international solidarity associations focusing on those converts and the mandatory power, but it was also working on planning how to settle these people. Last but not least, the ACO came in contact with Armenian refugees immigrating in France, men who had been in contact with Beirut during his time in the Hilfsbund, continued being in contact and started with his help building communities in Marseille under Pastor Khazar Ossian in particular and in Lyon. In all these fields of operation, Beirut insisted upon the necessary missionary dimension of the work. Indeed, there were tensions about that with ACO personnel that was deemed to underplay missionary work, in particular Dr. Monnier, the physician at the ACO hospital in Aleppo in the second half of the 1920s. Missionary work was done towards Armenian and Assyrian refugees, towards Eastern Christians, and towards Muslims. Yet it should be borne in mind that the list of the ACO's fields of operation falls short of the initial ambitions of Beirut. Moreover, there was a notable degree of decentralized decision within the organization. Falling short of the ambition, of the Beirut's ambition, what do I mean? Well, by 1926, Beirut was making his plans for the ACO more public, and he basically presented a whole plan for colonization to resettle Armenian refugees, focusing on the agricultural settlement of refugees in the Sanjak of Alexandretta. By and large, this geography and generally speaking, the geography of the ACO's project dovetailed with the plans of the mandatory administration. Both plans had in common the attempt at resettling refugees in autonomous territories such as Alexandretta and the Latakia Governorate, or in largely out of the way and largely autonomous parts of the state of Syria, such as Upper Jazireh. The ACO's plan required a budget that it could hardly shoulder on its own through private donations. This is where support from the Netherlands and Switzerland could play a big role, but still it fell short of the goals. Now, the larger project notwithstanding, the ACO maintained a localized field of operation, and this is where initiatives were not always coordinated. Beirut complained that Hedwig Bull was often reluctant towards innovation in the work, but he himself was also kind of holding her back. By 1930, she had started what she presented as a long cherished project, temperance work among Armenian refugees in Aleppo. And what she got from Beirut was a swift rebuttal. He said, basically, you have much enough on your hands already. It seems also that he saw the new work as a diversion from direct missionary work. These divisions should not be overblown because, as we know, Edvig stayed for a very long time under the ACO in Syria. There were a number of missionaries who stayed for a long period. So basically, there was something binding these people together. But they highlight the hiatus among ACO members about missionary priorities. People did not always see quite eye to eye on this. This hiatus was exacerbated by the relations the ACO had with especially other national actors, with actors of other nationalities in the mandates, including Protestant institutions of various nationality. And so this will be my last point here. The ACO was formally French, functionally French, but actually an international mission with a staff made of Armenian and Assyrian workers, as well as workers from neutral countries, much more than it had French staff. And it worked internationally from within in a competitive humanitarian field where internationalism was also being enacted because a number of missionary humanitarian work was in keeping with the League of Nations. If there were debates within the ACO regarding priorities of operation, sorry, I realize that I'm already in overtime. Panic, panic, panic. So what I mean to say here is that the humanitarian field of operation on emergency relief towards refugees shaped missionary action through the 1920s and somehow created a tension between people who focused on matters of efficiency of the work, including with a large coefficient of social sciences and medical sciences dictating macroscopic views of the work at the expense of personalized relations with the beneficiaries, and people who were insisting on maintaining the missionary character of the work and also the personalized dimension of the work through that. And so I'd like to just briefly sketch the relationship of the ACO with three categories of national actors. First, the French and the French authorities to begin with. The French authorities were at first uncertain about the ACO, but they needed its operational capacity. And so basically, while it was suspicious of its German ties, it needed to subcontract it for humanitarian work, just as it was subcontracting much of the humanitarian work at the time to American or British or Scandinavian organizations. This meant that the Hilfsbund itself was not to appear in any way. And when it was solicited about having the Hilfsbund reappear formally in the field in Syria, Béon said that in the granting of visas, in particular, the French authorities were extremely touchy, uses the German adjective spröd to say this. So there was no way the Hilfsbund or its German members could come there, but at the same time, the Hilfsbund was more than happy to lend a number of its workers to the ACO. So not only was the Hilfsbund basically behind or supporting the foundation of the ACO in 1922, encouraging its Alsatian members to join the ACO, but it kept providing it with staff, provided though that staff was made of neutral or Alsatian citizens. The mandatory authorities were goaded in their skepticism at first by the Jesuits, who took advantage of their position of influence under High Commissioners Sarai and Weygand to denounce the large plans of Véron and in order to construe him as an agent of the Hilfsbund. In their correspondence with the apostolical delegate in Beirut, they were more clear and basically said, this guy is a German Protestant missionary, so this is why we should fight him. Over time, first the Jesuits took much less interest in the ACO, and the French authorities seem to have grown more business-like in its relationship with the ACO, especially as Béron was liaising with the other Protestant Français in Syria and Lebanon. And so basically the two branches of so-called French Protestant work in Syria and Lebanon were having regular mutual consultations and a division of the territory, basically. Yet Béron firmly opposed any further integration, especially when a project was formulated of a French Protestant bishop in Syria, aimed at solving constant problems of recruitment of pastors, especially in out-of-the-way places. Here he said, basically, this cannot go with our Swiss and Dutch committees, both because of the subordination to a French pastor and because of the denominational diversity of the ACO, which Béron did not want to be seen as a Lutheran endeavor. Moreover, some of the ACO's projects were a pain in the neck for the French, not least the project of Kurdish classes in the schools in Derik and Khanik, which were formulated at the time when France was trying to get rid of Syria or giving it more accurately an independence treaty that would enable it to self-govern itself under French influence in 1936, 1938. So at the time, basically, the French didn't want to hurt Arab nationalist sensitivities. And so basically they said, no Kurdish classes. Regarding Germany, Béron maintained close relations with his former boss, Schuchart, and the director of the Hilfsbund in the early 1920s, and this enabled him materially to take over from the Hilfsbund. So the material that the Hilfsbund had left in Marash at the time of the fightings around there in 1920, that had been repatriated to Aleppo, was leased free of charge to the ACO from 1924 onwards. Yet over time, especially after 1933, Swiss and Dutch partners appear to have taken more importance than the Hilfsbund in the workings of the ACO. Especially the Dutch committee provided up to 2/3 of the organization's budget until World War II. So there is kind of a reclining influence of the Hilfsbund, although it does have a close link, especially with Béron. As for the Swiss committee, it took over work during World War II to the extent that its bosses, Nussli and Burnier, tried to take over the board of direction from its Alsatian direction in 1945, claiming that the French direction was useful while there was a French colonial power. But then, with World War II, the Swiss committee had become the relevant actor in the field, and so they asked to take over. Béron refused, saying, basically, it's not for functional reason that I'm in my position, but he also gave greater place in the administration of the ACO to the delegates of the Swiss committee. Béron's relationship with American missionary and humanitarian bodies in Syria and Lebanon is telling about his perspective, maintaining both the missionary character and the independence of the ACO against the possibility of donor dependency. Please tell me to stop when you are really falling asleep.
I think we're not falling asleep. It's very, very interesting. And I know there is a lot to say
and make it short.
Continue in the archive of the ICO, but maybe it's time to conclude temporarily, at least.
So, yes, basically about the Americans, I wanted to say that some in the SCO, such as Cathy Osterman, wanted to work with the Rockefeller Foundation and get big budgets to realize their colonization projects. Béron consistently objected to that at every level. He feared that the Rockefeller Foundation, with good reasons, by the way, would press towards secularized action to avoid friction with the beneficiaries of help. So, to conclude, I would argue that the ACO managed its network of relations so as to maintain its missionary calling against attempts at channeling its action in a larger colonial agenda or towards secularized humanitarianism. If initially it was its German links that prevented the ACO to fit within the French colonial quadrillage of humanitarianism and influence, over time it was the international nature of its recruitment and financing that played against its integration into French policy and kept it therefore independent. Likewise, German links, and especially the pre-existing connections with specific missionary organizations in Germany, namely the Hilfsbund, which didn't like so much Rockefeller, and especially hated to see it work with Dr. Lepsius. So these connections precluded close collaboration with major US humanitarian institutions, which was seen as leading to donor dependency. As a result, the scope of the ACO's operation was scaled down. Maintaining independence, a lasting preoccupation within the organization, has a silver lining. While Syrian independence in 1946 had brutal consequences for other French-based organizations, the ACO was able to continue work even with a continued French direction. What Samir Boulos observes with the German Evangelical Mission in northern Sudan holds true of the ACO. Distance with the colonial power was a condition to continue operating in a post-colonial world. And I thank you, and especially for your patience.
Dear Philippe, thank you very much. It's really interesting. I think in ACO still now we have a lot of debates about this question of internationalism and how to manage independency and how to deal with powers and so on. And I look forward for your future research in the ACO archives, and there is a lot to understand. Thank you very much. I would like to remind everybody that you can ask questions in the chat to address to the different speakers. And after the last contribution, we will take your questions and have a moment of discussions and exchange.